I believe that everybody has a story, and I'm fascinated to hear them. So come with me as we take a walk down Fascination Street. Welcome back, Streetwalkers. This episode is with Srinivas Rao. Srini is an author, podcaster, and chief creative instigator at Unmistakable Creative. He has a podcast called the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, which is a lot like this, except wildly different. It's like not even wildly different. It's a lot like this. He has varied guests broaching varied subjects, which are all fascinating, and I'm so glad he didn't name his show Fascination Street like I did. But his show is the most like this show that I've ever been exposed to, so check that out for sure. In this episode, we talk about him being a kid from India growing up in a rural South Texas town and what those experiences were like. We also talk about how he got into podcasting. We talk about a couple of his books. And we talk about where I discovered him, which was on the Netflix television show Indian Matchmaking. And again, you should definitely check out his show. I've listened to a bunch of his episodes. They're informative and fascinating. Plus, we even have shared a guest, and I won't tell you who that is. You'll have to find out yourself when you listen right now. This was recorded during all the self-distancing due to the coronavirus outbreak. So if that is over by now, woohoo. If not, damn it. But either way, this is my conversation with Srinivas Rao. Yeah, talk to me, yeah. Welcome to Fascination Street Podcast, Srinivas Rao. How you doing, Srini?
I am good. Thank you so much for having me.
It is 100% my pleasure. Now, I did just a little bit of research, and I know that you are an author. You have written at least one book called An Audience of One, Reclaiming Creativity for Its Own Sake. I know you've written a few other books, but I don't know the names of those. So, but first, we'll get to all those. But first, I'd like to start off asking my guests where they were born and raised, because it sort of helps us understand how you got from where you were to where you are, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I love that question because I've used it myself, and you're absolutely right. It is a great question. I think that question prompts stories, which is really what makes anybody have a good podcast. So I really appreciate the question. So I was actually born in India, but I was raised all over the world. My dad is a college professor, so we spent about 4 years in Australia where he was doing his PhD, another 4 years in Canada where he did postdoctoral work, and then another 7 years in Texas where he did postdoctoral work until we finally landed in California when I was a sophomore in high school. And one of the interesting things about moving so much is that you don't have friends that you've known for your entire life. Like my sister and I have these very different upbringings because, my parents were building their careers while I was growing up, and my dad was much more established by the time she kind of came to the same age. So she's had the same group of friends since fifth grade, many of who were at her wedding. They come to our house for Christmas. They even come to my birthday parties because they've just been such a dominant presence in her life. So I think it's not a coincidence. I always jokingly say that I've chosen to build my platform and career in a way that ensures that I never stop meeting new people. Maybe it's this like Freudian fear that I won't be connected to people because of the fact that we move so much. But every one of these places has had a very significant impact on my worldview, how I think about people. And somebody asked me once, was going from Australia to Canada culture shock? And I said, no, I tell you, the biggest culture shock was going from Canada to Texas, because in Canada, my parents had this very tight-knit group of Indian friends. There's a huge Indian community. I can't remember a single weekend where we didn't have some social engagement to go to. In fact, the way my dad built his friendships, it's funny to think about this in the age of Facebook and the internet, but I was sitting with their friends one day. They came to visit for dinner, and I said, how did you guys actually meet? And my dad told me, well, he said, I opened up the phone book and I looked for the first Telugu last name. So Telugu is the language we speak, but Andhra Pradesh, the state we're from, people from there are called Telugus. And my dad literally looked up the name of somebody who was Telugu in the phone book, called them, and explained that he was new here. And the guy was like, yeah. He was like, well, there's a wedding this weekend that everybody's at, but there's a function next weekend. So, give me a call and I'll let you know. It's funny to think that that's how he built this massive community of lifelong friends.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's such an innovative way, especially back then. That was before the internet.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's an amazing way to have done that. But you were about to tell me how it was more of a culture shock to move from Canada to Texas.
Yeah.
Why?
So keep in mind, like you go from this, big city like Edmonton, Alberta, with, a very sort of diverse population to a place like Bryan, Texas. And by the way, for people who don't know where Bryan, Texas is, it's the same town that Texas A&M is in. Texas A&M is technically in College Station. So we always just say College Station because nobody knows where the hell Bryan is. But you go from being sort of in this incredibly diverse population to a predominantly white town to the point where, my mom, I remember when she picked me up from school in third grade, because there are a lot of Hispanic people in Texas. My mom sees this young girl and she's like, "Oh, you should be friends with that girl. She looks like she's Indian." I was like, "No, Mom, she's Mexican." And so my mom, I think for the first 5 months, thought every Mexican person she saw was Indian until they realized, there aren't that many Indian people. So that was like the first sort of big shock. But the funny thing about small towns and places like that is they grow on you in a really weird sort of way because, we left after my freshman year in high school, which is a really weird time to be uprooted. And by that point, I had established friends. But I think the biggest thing that came from that time in Texas that had probably the most significant impact on my career was being in band. I was the beneficiary of extraordinary teachers who, to this day, I can't understand why, for some reason, just made it their mission to pour their hearts and souls into me as a musician. I played tuba for about 9 years, which some people probably know or don't know. But the day I picked up the instrument, my band director told me, he said, "You're going to make all-state band one day." And, anybody who's watched a kid learn to play a musical instrument knows that usually it sounds like they're sacrificing animals when they start. And so I have no idea why he said that. But I think the thing that happens in a situation like that is the Pygmalion effect, right? The sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, because somebody basically has this expectation of you and all your actions suddenly align with that expectation. So I practiced and practiced and practiced to the point of driving everybody in my family crazy because tubas aren't quiet. My sister hated the fact that I was so committed to this instrument. But, I went on to make all-state band 3 times in a row in high school. I ultimately never chose to pursue music as a career. My dad, being the wise person that he was, talked me out of it because, anybody who has seen an orchestra knows there's only one tuba in an orchestra. So you're basically waiting for somebody to die for a job to open up. And not only that, even in an orchestra, the tuba parts are so minimal in most cases. I remember playing in the orchestra at Berkeley my first semester, and I was thinking to myself, we were playing some Vivaldi concerto, and there was literally one whole note for the tuba. I'm like, what, did Vivaldi get pissed off at some tuba player and write this in just to punish him? So I literally sat on the back of the audience reading a book for like an hour and a half. And after that, I kind of, despite this thing having been, lifelong passion, lost interest in it. But I think the thing that came from that experience was a level of discipline, the, knowledge that despite not having any natural aptitude for something, with practice I could improve. And I think that that's deeply informed my practice as a writer, as a creative, as a podcast host, all of that. I think that they really taught me about the power of discipline, consistency, and practice. And I am forever grateful for that. Like I even said in Audience of One, I think my 9th grade band director deserves far more credit than he gets for where I've ended up today.
Well, that is a sweet thing to say to that person. I think maybe I only had one teacher in my entire scholastic career that I didn't feel hated being there. So good for you.
I was very lucky. I mean, I think that says a lot about the current education system. I was just thinking about this morning because you have a system where you quantify people with these metrics like grades and rankings. And as a result, you get a lot of smart, creative people who believe they're not. I got good grades because of Indian parents who instilled rigid discipline. But by the time I got to college, for the first time in my life, I actually felt that I wasn't that smart. And it's unfortunate that something like that does such a number on somebody's self-esteem.
Oh, it really does, too. Let's go back to your Texas years. So being an Indian kid growing up in, small redneck town, Bryan, I said redneck, you didn't. What was your experience? I know it was different coming from a place where there was a lot of people who looked like you to going to a place where arguably almost nobody looked like you.
Yeah.
Was there an air of racism, or was there, I guess it's hard to put into words, but I think you know what I'm asking.
Absolutely, yeah. So, I think we'd be lying if we said there wasn't. I think that this is kind of interesting because, for the most part, Indians are considered model minorities. Like, what do people think of as doctors, engineers, lawyers, and people who own 7-Elevens? And by the way, or people who work at 7-Elevens. And for those you don't know, the guy who works at 7-Eleven probably owns 50 of them.
That's true.
That's kind of a funny thing. So we're fortunate in that our stereotype is one of the model minority. But I mean, it was the kind of thing where I saw blatant racism with, friends of mine. I had a friend, and I still to this day can't ever forget the moments that I would, be in the car with his mom, who was this upper middle class, educated white person. I mean, they came from one of the wealthiest families in town. And the amount of times I heard her use the N-word, it baffled me that they could be that openly racist. Like, I remember in 9th grade, there was a day when a kid got killed at our school. 2 black kids got in a scuffle and one stabbed the other, and the guy who got stabbed ended up dying. And I remember my friend's mom picking us up from school. My dad was working, so he couldn't come and get me because we were all sent home from school that day. And she literally said, now that N-word got killed, you can go get your hair cut. And we went to the country club where these guys played golf, and we were served lunch by a black waiter. And that experience forever stayed with me because it was like, wow, there's blatant racism here. But on the flip side of that, the people in Texas are some of the nicest people in the world. They're so friendly. That Southern hospitality thing is absolutely true. Even my mom, when we moved to California, complained. She said, people in the grocery store in Texas say hi to you. They're friendly. They want to know how you're doing. In California, like, get a move on. There's other people behind you. So I always look back on that experience with fondness because in one way, I think part of it is that you're misunderstood just because there's not a lot of cultural reference points for people in a town like that. Sometimes I felt discriminated against by black people and Mexican people. It's like, because it's like, oh, I was this anomaly. It's like, you're Indian. And I think by the time I got to 6th grade, there had been a total of 3 Indian kids in our class. I even had a friend who immigrated from India when I was in 9th grade, super cool kid, and he was Punjabi and came with a turban. And I remember seeing him the summer after 9th grade, and I didn't recognize him because he had actually cut his hair, which Sikhs don't do that, But I think that at a certain point, navigating the dynamics of living in a town like that became so difficult that he actually ended up ditching the turban and cutting his hair. And his parents actually probably were okay with it. So, no matter where you grow up, being a teenager is a pretty awful experience. Like, I would never wish that up on anybody. I mean, if any one of us ever had to go live through our teenage lives again, we'd be like, yeah, that's one period of my life where I would happily never revisit,
Yeah, I think that's pretty true across, like you said, all cultures and all ages. I mean, the media and movies and TV shows make high school seem like it was really cool sometimes, like all of John Hughes. All the John Hughes movies make it seem awesome. Yeah. But, it was really only awesome for probably 4 people in each class. For everybody else, it was the most awkward and most doubting time of their lives.
Well, it's funny you say that because I've gotten to reconnect with people from that high school. And the funniest one was that, I was living in Costa Rica, walking around the streets of Tamarindo, and I had a Texas A&M shirt on. And the woman who owned the youth hostel there was walking with these 2 guys. And one of them said, "Where'd you get that T-shirt?" And I was like, "Well, I used to live in College Station." They're like, "Wait a minute, that's where we're from." And I'm like, "Really?" I was like, "What high school did you go to?" And they're like, "Okay." And it turned out it would have been the high school I graduated from. Like, wait a minute, what year did you graduate? I was like, "Okay, wait a minute. That means we have to have known each other." And it's funny because it turned out we had known of each other and my friend Grant, who I thought was one of the popular kids. And so we never became friends. And, we ended up smoking a joint together, like reminiscing on old times. And it turned out that there was so much I misunderstood. Like, that year in 8th grade when I thought he was one of the popular kids, it turned out his dad passed away. There's all these things I think that we misunderstand about people's lives based on what we see on the surface. And the truth is that often these people aren't as awesome as we think they are, or like feeling on top of the world as we think they are. And often they're even much nicer than we think. Like, I always think to myself, it's like, there's the prettiest girl in school. No, that everybody thought she was the prettiest girl in school. And maybe deep down, she's the most insecure girl in school.
Yeah, I think that stems from nobody really talks to each other. Yeah. There's the biggest lack of communication at that age. And then, we sort of learn it going forward because, our parents put us in school so that we can be socialized and all that. And we talk to our little friends when we're super small kids, hey, like when you're a tiny kid, it's not embarrassing to have an imaginary friend. Everybody does. And so, and then you're playing with toys and you're recreating Star Wars scenes or G.I. Joe or whatever with your friends. And so you really get to know them. But then as you grow older and, your body and your mind start to go through changes, then you become like the most mortified, embarrassed person about opening up to anybody ever.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of sets the table for the lack of communication that we have, which is, I think, one of the biggest problems in the country right now is a lack of communication or a lack of willing to understand or listen to somebody who isn't us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the other thing is, that's a period in our lives where we're deeply driven by external validation. It's not cool to be uncool. So you do everything you can to try to fit in. And the irony is now we live in a world where you don't get rewarded for fitting in. You get rewarded for standing out. I mean, that's, been the central ethos of everything that I have done with my creative work is never to look at what other people do, to learn from them. But basically what I say is, use other people's ingredients to come up with your own recipes. So, our sort of defining idea is, okay, is this unmistakable? And so, even when building a brand, like one of the deliberate things we did was to make sure that when our work rolls through your newsfeed, you damn well know it came from us and nobody else, because the signature is consistent. It's unique. I've made a point to kind of look at what other people do and borrow small things, but also to not look too much at what other people do, which is so easy when you live in a world where, there's authority figures and personal development gurus and influencers, which I think is the most ridiculous term ever. Like, what are you exactly influencing? Like, I don't influence shit as far as I'm concerned.
I do think that is probably the dumbest word that has come out of the last, 20 years. It's a ridiculous word.
Yeah. I mean, like, okay, you know what? Joe Biden is an influencer. I'm somebody who creates a podcast. There's a difference. Like, yes, you can call yourself an influencer, but having 1 million followers on Instagram and putting up pictures of yourself doesn't make you an influencer. I'm sorry.
Well, I agree wholeheartedly.
Hey, Streetwalkers. Here's a word from our sponsors.
Magic 8 Ball. Should people visit disabilityshirts.com?
Yes, I am sure.
This is Sammy Hooney. I play Esperanza on Netflix's Raising Dion, and you're listening to the Fascination Street podcast. If you're looking for some shirts with inclusive messages, check out my store, disabilityshirts.com.
Let's get back into it.
Real quick, just to cap off the Texas thing, as a lifelong Texas boy, it
That's
hurts
right.
my heart.
You're in San Antonio.
Yeah.
I saw that on your bio,
I am in
which
San
is an
Antonio,
amazing
yes,
city, by the way. Like, so Allstate Band is on the Riverwalk.
Hell yeah.
Funny thing is, I never told you, I missed Allstate Band by one chair in Texas.
No.
And of course, as you know, as a lifelong Texas person, Texas is a breeding ground for world-class musicians.
That's true.
And then we came to California and I made Allstate Band 3 years in a row. But I remember the Riverwalk is probably one of my favorite places in Texas.
Oh, that is sweet. But it hurts my heart to know that in any small Texas town that there's that kind of rampant and open racism. I was born in San Antonio and lived almost all of my life in San Antonio, which is a predominantly Hispanic town. Yeah. And also San Antonio has the largest Martin Luther King walk in the country every year.
Uh-huh.
But I never got to experience that level of racism because, well, A, I'm white, but B, I didn't grow up in a small town. So that does hurt my heart, but I'm glad that you capped that story off by telling a sweet story.
Yeah, keep in mind, like, Texas is one of those places, I have nothing but fond memories. Like, yeah, those things stand out. But I mean, I went back for the first time in 25 years to College Station sometime last year. Like, I gave a speech at my sister's wedding. And if you're the elder sibling at an Indian wedding without a date, you're kind of an open target. So rather than making myself an open target, I put up a picture of my phone number on the screen to open my talk. And I said, for everybody who wants to know when I'm getting married, you can text profiles, pictures, and all other relevant information to this number. Now let's get to why we're actually here. And one of the guys in the audience, one of my brother-in-law's friends, was a professor at A&M. So he invited me back to come and give a talk there. And
a paid one. Yeah.
Which is funny because I would tell friends, like, I made $2,500 off my sister's wedding speech. They're like, you charged your sister for a wedding speech? I was like, nah. But my 9th grade biology teacher drove 50 miles from Huntsville to come and have dinner with me. And that is something I think is very, very much a part of the spirit of Texans that people don't understand. Because, what do you see? Like crazy redneck Trump supporters who you think, oh, everybody in Texas is like that. And that's not true. People in Texas are amazing. Like, I never had teachers in California who would do that. But the fact that the guy was willing to drive 50 miles just to come and have dinner with me, like, that speaks volumes about how kind, how generous, and how friendly so many of the people in a town like College Station are, despite the fact that there are undertones of racism there. So I don't want to neglect that when we look at this.
Cool. Well, I appreciate that. And as far as California, you can't get a teacher to drive that far to have lunch with you. Hell, in LA, you can't get your best friend to pick you up from the airport.
That is true. My parents don't pick me up from the airport if I fly into LAX. They're like, no, you have to fly to the airport nearest to our house. Like, they don't pick up our own relatives. They're like, rent a car because it's such a pain in the ass.
All right. Now, moving away from Texas, which is what you did a long time ago and we're going to do right now. I don't know why I'm asking this question, but it just occurs to me. Did you go to Pepperdine?
Probably because of my Skype name. So I went to Berkeley as an undergrad, and I went to Pepperdine for my MBA program. So yeah, that is very bizarre education. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer questions about either.
No, I didn't have any. I was just surprised that I didn't already know that about you. I only know one other person who went to Pepperdine, and that was Clint Howard. Clint Howard is Ron Howard's little brother, who has also been in the business since he was 4 or 3 or something like that.
Well, given that I am a huge fan of all things that Brian Grazer and Ron Howard do, that's music to my ears because I just love everything those guys do. I think if you're a Texas person, like, you look at Friday Night Lights and you're just like, I love this show because it's so accurate. Like, it's such a well-told story.
It is a well-told story, and it's because it's all based in truth. But Clint Howard, he won a scholarship. He wrote some article for some newspaper, or I don't know what it was, but he won a journalistic scholarship for 1 semester, I think, at Pepperdine. And, the family business is acting and had been for a while, so he really only went because he had that scholarship. And then when he got there on his first day and they realized who he was, they took it away from him because they said, wait a minute, this scholarship is for people in need. You're not in need.
Yeah, that
so he wasn't
true.
there very long. That's the only thing I know about Pepperdine. So what did you want to be when you grew up? I know it wasn't a tuba player because there's only 50 of those good paying jobs in the country. So what was it?
Well, so this has changed throughout my life. It's funny because, you found out about me because of my Netflix appearance, and like there was this whole idea of, oh, this guy doesn't have a plan. And I always jokingly say, I was like, talk to somebody who had a plan when they were 20 and they'll tell you their life looks very different than that plan when they're 40. This is 22 years later speaking. So, growing up in an Indian family, of course, you're told become a doctor, lawyer, engineer. And of course, like, I bought into the, I'm going to become a doctor thing. But deep down, the only reason I wanted to become a doctor is because all the doctors I knew had nice cars and big houses. I didn't actually want to be a doctor. And so I think once I came to that realization, I had a very vague sort of idea of what I wanted to do when I got to Berkeley. It was, I know I want to work in business. And so I worked in sales. But, doing what I'm doing was never on the list. And I think what led me to this was in 2006, 2007, I decided, okay, I'm going to apply to business school. I fell in love. It's funny, we're talking about Ron Howard. I have always had this deep love for movies and entertainment of all kinds. And so I got fired from yet another job a year before I was applying to business school. I was like, okay, well, I can't just sit on my ass for a year. I got to make some money. So I ended up getting this job at Nielsen Net Ratings, which was Nielsen's online division, because deep down what I wanted to do, I thought when I went to business school, like, I wanted to work in entertainment, and I wanted to basically work in programming for a television network. I wanted to choose what went on the air. And I got to LA to get this rude awakening that nobody hires MBAs to do creative work in the entertainment industry. I was like, well, I don't want to sit around crunching spreadsheets at Disney. I want to be a part of making movies at a place like Disney. And so I ended up actually having a summer internship at Intuit as their social media intern. Now, keep in mind, this was 2008 when social media was just starting to become much more prominent in our lives and much more important to businesses. And I didn't get an offer at the end of the internship. My boss was like, yeah, he's like, look, And he said, we'd be doing you a huge disservice if we made an offer and you really didn't do your job. You just sat around making things with the internet, which, people ask me, what do you do? I'm like, I use the internet to make things. Like, that's ultimately, at the core of what I do. But as luck would have it, I graduated in 2009 from business school, which was a terrible time to get out of school. So I had all this time on my hands. And at that point, this gap between creativity and technology was becoming a lot more narrow. It was easier to start things and build things. And one of my classmates, who was actually a roommate of mine, had turned me on to Seth Godin's blog, which I started reading on and off. And I thought, okay, you know what? Let me start a blog. So I kept the blog while I was in Brazil. I did a study abroad there. It was kind of half-assed because I didn't really understand how it all worked. And then when I was finishing school, there was this girl who had this website called Twitter Should Hire Me that ended up going viral and getting all sorts of media attention. And I was like, oh, well, I should do something like that. And so I created this website called 100 Reasons You Should Hire Me. And it was a disaster because I couldn't come up with 100 reasons why anybody should hire me. So that was the end of that. But it was the sort of first inkling of, okay, let me see if I can do something to stand out, because you got to keep in mind, this is a time when companies were getting upwards of 1,000 resumes from highly qualified and even overqualified applicants to take jobs that were $10 an hour jobs. I heard stories where recruiters were getting so inundated, they would literally print out a stack of like 500 resumes and throw the top 300 off the pile, because who's going to go through all of that? So as a result, I knew I had to do something to stand out. And so I started a blog. I mean, I'd always loved the idea of being a writer. When I finished undergrad, I sat in a room for 8 days straight and wrote a 63-page single-spaced autobiography about my life in college. And I don't know why I did it, because, I didn't have an audience or anything like that. But writing had always been sort of this backdrop of something I enjoyed doing. And even at my first job that I hated with a passion, one of my friends started what was then a blog, but we didn't call it that. He would just have us send in stories about our summers. And I would write these ridiculous stories about the things that happened to me. Like, I worked at a startup where everybody ate Indian food for lunch and there was only one shitter. That's bad design. And then there was a time a guy tried to beat me up at the hometown buffet because he thought I looked at his kid funny. And so, like, there's just all these ridiculous antics that kind of were making it. So I always tended to tinker and dabble with technology. But right after I graduated from business school, I thought, okay, you know what? I got all this time on my hands after 2 weeks of drowning my sorrows in vodka and realizing Indian parents don't have tolerance for an alcoholic, unemployed son. I thought, okay, you know what? I got to do something with this time. So I started writing, and I didn't really know where it was going to lead. The irony, of course, is that I am like the worst employee in the world, but I started that blog as a way to help me stand on the job market and get a job. And I did eventually because of it, but even that came to an end because it just wasn't part of my long-term plan. The podcast was largely an accident. From starting that blog, I was in this course where one of the lessons was to interview somebody. And the 13th guy I interviewed, I emailed him, I think maybe 4 or 5 months after we had done our interview, and said, hey, I'm thinking about starting a multi-author blog. Would you like to contribute? Blah, blah, blah. And he's like, no, that's a terrible idea, and I don't have the time for it. But he sends me this really lengthy email about my interview series and suggests that we spin it out into a separate site. And an hour later, I mocked up a version of a WordPress site, and I said, hey, is this what you had in mind? Let me know when you want to get started. I don't think he meant that he wanted to be my partner, but I took him along for the ride, and that's kind of where we're at. And this is, I think, what it comes down to is that in a very roundabout way, I am actually doing what I wanted to do, which is, choose what goes on the air. But not only do I get to choose it, I get to create it. And let's just say that nobody could have planned this, and I would never recommend that somebody try to reverse engineer my career path as a way to replicate what I've accomplished, because mine has basically been a resume of failures and getting fired from lots of jobs. It's funny because they're like, you never talk to a self-made person about luck, and it sounds obnoxious even saying that there was an element of luck involved. But I mean, I've been the beneficiary of a lot of lucky circumstances when it comes to this. Like I got a 10-year head start in what's become a massive cultural trend now. I had this amazing mentor who took me under his wing, some guy I met on Twitter who happened to have been one of my podcast guests. Yeah, I mean, there have been a lot of things that there's no way I could reverse engineer. So I'm always mindful of that and very grateful that there are a lot of opportunities that I've been given that most people would kill for. And at the same time, we all benchmark against people who are better than us or who are further ahead.
Yeah, that makes sense. And for those listening, the name of the show is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. And not only has he been doing this for over 10 years, you're approaching 900 episodes or something like that.
I think we're probably at 1,000.
Are you?
Yeah, I mean, you might not see all 900,000 in the catalog,
Sure.
but we definitely we've had a lot. Let's just put it that way.
Yes, and among some of those more notable guests, everybody is fascinating, and I use the word fascinating on purpose. The people that you have heard of, obviously, those are fascinating, and you're going to be interested in those. But the people that you might not have heard of are also fascinating because they have expertise in areas that you might not have even thought about, and then you'll be intrigued by. So if you're a truly curious person, or if you're genuinely fascinated by people's stories, which I know you are because you're listening to this, then I highly recommend you check out the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. Now, among some of these guests, he's had Tim Ferriss, Seth Godin, Jordan Harbinger, Simon Sinek, even Justine Musk, Elon's ex-wife. So there's, and previous guest to this show, Vinny Tortorich, was on like 6 years ago or something like that. So,
yeah,
well done. When did you decide that a podcast was going to be the way to go? I know you said you wanted to start it as a blog or whatever, and then your now partner or maybe ex-partner sort of helped you turn that into, a separate series of interviews and things. So when did you decide to do that behind a microphone?
Yeah, so that was early 2010. So we started, in 2009 with a weekly interview series called Interviews with Up-and-Coming Vloggers. I do want to make one comment about the guests that you noted and the people that people have never heard of. The people who have never heard of are our best guests. They're the most interesting ones because you haven't heard them on 1,000 podcasts. Like, I've interviewed everybody from porn stars to drug dealers to bank robbers and presidential candidates. And they're just fun because they're fascinating. I mean, that's my number one filter for how I choose, which is why it's so hard for people to figure out. It's like, what do you look for? I'm like, I can't tell you that because my only criteria is, does this make me curious? Which I think you and I share that in common. So that's literally how I choose every single guest. And I say no to famous people all the time, which probably pisses them off because everybody says yes to them. But we started as a podcast for bloggers. We spun it out into a site called Blogcast FM. And then 2013, the mentor I was working with came along and he said, I think that you need to rebrand the whole thing. We could see kind of clearly what was going to happen in the online marketing world as podcasting now became this like trend and tactic for online marketers. We're like, this is going to turn into a gigantic circle jerk. Pardon my, crudeness, but it kind of has, like you hear the same people talking about the same things on every show. Everybody's trying to do the same format. So we deliberately went away from that, despite having built our first sort of base of listeners on this idea of helping people build blogs. And I just lost interest in talking to people about that stuff because after a while it got kind of boring. And so when we looked back and we said, what are your favorite interviews? And there was always with people who had fascinating stories. And when we started thinking about listeners, instead of going to bloggers and online marketers, I called a friend of mine who would listen, who had nothing to do with this world. And he told me that his favorite interviews were, the ones that often had nothing to do with those, because we looked at it and said, like, the real market here is not this little subset of entrepreneurs, but it's normal people who want to hear stories. So in a lot of ways, like, we create entertainment more than anything else. I see myself as an entertainer and part educator. So to me, audio is a storytelling medium first and an information medium second. And that's why we listen, when people are entertaining. That's why we want to listen to fascinating stories. So like if you listen to the design of Unmistakable Creative, I ask the questions I do to open up kind of like yourself, because I understood that human beings are wired to listen to stories. It's why NPR has these things called driveway moments. And so the idea was, okay, how do you create an experience where somebody presses play and they can't stop listening? Does that always happen? Maybe not. But to me, that is really what I am always after, is the story, because I think the person's story is far more interesting than the accomplishments that lie on top of it.
Well, that makes 100% sense. And like you said at the top of that, that is something that we have in common. The whole reason that I started my show is that my wife used to travel Monday through Friday for work. And so when I would go to fly to wherever she was going to be, I would indelibly meet people on planes, in cars, or just, at the airport and, strike up a conversation. And then I was so engaged or, fascinated by their life story and what they did or how they, whatever. And so after too many of those got away, I was like, man, like I should do this for everybody to hear, because I truly believe that everybody has a fascinating story, but they just don't think so because it's their story. And so it's sort of humdrum.
Yeah.
And when I found your show after, I saw you on the TV show, and then I looked you up and started listening to a few of your episodes, it strikes me that your show is the most like my show that I have found out there, because it's a one-on-one engagement that is totally born out of honest curiosity and fascination with trying to get to know this other person. And you don't have one particular style of guest. You're not all athletes. You're not all actors. You're not all authors. You sort of are everybody. I mean, just the 4 or 5 that I listened to, which were people I had never heard of. One of them was David Epstein. One of them was Karen Rinaldi. I don't know who those people are, but I couldn't stop listening because they were so engaged and engaging, if that makes any sense. So you're doing a great job with what you're doing.
Thank you.
And so I just want to say thank you for helping make our style of podcasting more prevalent.
I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hey, Streetwalkers, here's a word from our sponsors.
Hey, hello. Are you interested in getting from A to B while sitting? At Detroit Bikes, we've got a new product that I think you're going to love. It's a bicycle. It's got 2 wheels, hence the bi. And the sickle is because it's a cycle that your wheel's going. So this is a product where you've got a seat. You are actually sitting while moving.
Wow.
And it's as easy as just pedaling, pushing with your legs. So we think that customers are going to love this product, and we hope you'll check it out at www.detroitbikes.com.
www.detroitbikes.com.
Let's get back into it.
Now, we talked a little bit about it, I guess, at the top, but let's talk about the show. So my wife and I were date night or whatever. We turned on the Netflix just to see what was up. And there was an advertisement they came across, and it said 98% match, which surprised me because we don't watch reality television.
Yeah, neither do I.
So it said 98% match, and it was called Indian Matchmaking. And my wife and I, we didn't even ask each other. We just looked at each other, smiled, and pushed play. And then we just plowed through the whole thing. And one of the people that was on that show was you.
Yeah.
And honestly, what made you stand out to me was that you were a podcaster. And I was immediately like, holy shit. And so I looked you up and started to know a little bit more about you, and then eventually asked you, and blah, 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 here we are. Now, I think I said the show's called Indian Matchmaking. It's a Netflix original. And the idea behind it is, I guess, to sort of let everybody who's not Indian in on how marriages are arranged in the Indian community. How did you become involved with this, and why did you say yes?
Yeah, good questions. So how I got involved is one of my friends from college who I kind of stayed in touch with. She was also a creative person. She's actually a member of our online community and has even taken some of my courses. She contacted me and she says, Srini, I know you're still single. One of my friends is doing a documentary about this, and, we're wondering if you'd be interested. And I was like, what the hell? I'm like, I am single. Like, I might meet somebody amazing. Worst case scenario, I get a lot of attention for my work, and I become the most eligible Indian bachelor in America, which part of that is true, part of it is not. So it just ended up being one of those things. So as far as why I said yes, like I think that my sort of metric for how I live my life is this going to be interesting? Is it going to make my life interesting? Now, keep in mind, obviously, with doing something like a reality television show, there are risks, particularly for somebody like me who has built a brand, who has, agents, editors, publishers, investors to think about, because everything you do in the public eye is a reflection of all the other people in your life at that point. So that was the thing that I went in with, is with that in mind. And I said yes because I'm single. I was open to the possibility that I might meet someone amazing. I will say this, like, despite how the match itself turned out, for me, the whole experience has been nothing but positive, because I didn't act like a jackass. I was polite. I was nice. And again, you also have to consider the fact that media creates both perception and misperceptions. Like, I say things on a daily basis to my roommates that are a PR crisis in the making, things that I would never say on air or on a media platform, particularly one as big as Netflix. I think it's about having the self-awareness to recognize that. So that's kind of how I got involved, why I said yes. It's definitely been interesting, sort of in the aftermath. For a while, people paid a lot of attention. My parents were inundated with calls from friends of theirs who had, potential suitors, all of who were not very attractive. And I had to basically tell my parents, I'm like, clearly your friends have poor judgment or have very low standards for me. So I'm going to have to pass on all these things. But overall, for me, it's been nothing but positive. I've not really been on the receiving end of a lot of harsh criticism, and my appearance was minimal. And to come back to a point you and I were talking about off air, this isn't my moment in the spotlight. It's just an inflection point in a much longer journey. I mean, I feel like I'm always still at the very beginning, because I feel like if you lose that curiosity and that willingness to learn and the humility to know when you're not good at something or when you could improve, then your ego destroys you. So, for example, right now, one of the exercises I've been doing every morning, I read this somewhere that Ben Franklin, one of the things he used to do to become a better writer was he would read something by somebody, whose books he enjoyed, and then he would try to rewrite it in his own words. So I'm actually going through Stephen Pressfield's books right now and trying to rewrite his stuff in my own words and then comparing it just as a practice, because I know that Pressfield is a much better writer than I am.
How is that exercise working for you?
It's okay. I mean, I just started it like 2 or 3 days ago. It's interesting because it really does teach you how to digest, the words that somebody else has put into something and really understand it. It also teaches you, it's like, okay, can I sum up this idea very concisely?
Nice. One of the quotes that I think it's from you, you said, fascination is your brain's most intense state of focus. When you're fascinated, it's a feeling of complete immersion. Some people call that flow.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So that actually isn't from me. It was from Sally Hogshead, who was a guest in our show.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
But flow is really, this optimal state of consciousness. So if you have ever done anything, for example, like go skiing, snowboarding, surfing, whatever it is, or those moments when you get so lost and wrapped up in whatever it is that you're doing that you lose sense of time. For athletes, they call it being in the zone. The perfect example of flow at work is Tom Brady in that Super Bowl that we all thought he was going to lose, the one against Atlanta, where, third quarter, you think, this game is over. And then suddenly he takes this game that literally looks to be over. Like, I still to this day remember Arthur Blank sitting on the sidelines just with this like shit-eating grin on his face because he thought Atlanta had won the game. Because, Atlanta was obliterating them. And I'm not even a sports fan, but I still watch that game because it reminds me of this. But you suddenly see this whole team move in synergy in a way that you kind of never see. Like nobody would have expected them to win. And yet I think that for somebody like Brady, he was so in the zone in that moment that it was inevitable that his performance was going to go through the roof. So like this is, really based on the work of Stephen Kotler, who is really the expert on flow. So flow basically is an optimal state of consciousness in which all aspects of performance go through the roof, action and awareness merge. And suddenly what starts out as a struggle feels effortless, even though you're working hard. And every one of us, hopefully at some point in our life, has experienced this, whether it's working on a project, whether it's at a job, where the day just flies by because you're enjoying what you're doing. And, to me, I think part of why I write every day still, despite not having a contract for another book, is for that reason. It does bring an immense amount of joy to my life.
Well, that makes 1,000% sense. And also that reminds me, bringing up that Patriots win, that reminds me of, it was the Spurs versus either Cleveland or Miami. All I know is the Spurs versus LeBron James.
Yeah.
And I think it was the Heat. And there was a game, I don't know, game 5 or I think it was 5, where it looked like the Spurs had it clinched. They were bringing out the champagne carts. And LeBron, after they came back and won, LeBron said on camera that he looked over and saw that champagne and said, "Not today." And so it was sort of that flow that you were talking about with Brady, where he just sort of put it on his back and said, "No, not on my watch. This ain't going down like that."
Yeah.
And then the LeBrons ended up winning the entire series. And like, it was ridiculous. But, as a San Antonio fan, it was ridiculous.
Well, I'm a weirdo who plays NBA 2K21 every day, but I don't actually couldn't tell you anything about what's actually going on in the NBA. Like, I love basketball video games. And, it's funny, the Spurs are one of my favorite teams in that game.
Oh, cool. Well, they were really great for a long time. But back to the show real quick. Who do you think on the show was most like you?
Funny you say that. Probably, there are two that come to mind. I probably got a dozen texts saying, hey, why didn't they match you with Nadia? And I was like, yeah, trust me, I'm wishing that too. The girl is, breathtakingly beautiful, friendly and sweet. And now she's kind of like America's princess. Like I was in touch with her briefly, when the show had aired, but now it's like impossible to get even a response from her. And I don't chase anybody's attention. Like, that's just not how I roll. Plus I live on the other side of the country. So, but probably her. And then Vyasar, the other guy who was like this comic book geek, I loved him. Like, I was like, this is a guy who is got this somewhat sorted past, but he's comfortable in his own skin and he's okay with the fact that he's got all these geeky hobbies. And that's so cool. Like, I admire that. I admire the fact that people are willing to own their quirks, their weirdness. Like, that resonates with me because that's kind of what I've built my entire career around is, the value of being weird.
Well, it's funny that you say that because he said when I interviewed him that you were his favorite person on the show. He loves you, man.
Yeah, no, I remember I tweeted him. I was like, dude, my roommates and I were saying, wow, if we're ever in Texas, we got to go meet this guy and have a drink with him. Like, he just seems cool.
He doesn't drink.
Yeah, well, either way, he just seemed like a cool dude. He was likable, he just had something. Yeah, I liked him a lot. Like, I was like, oh, this guy just seems awesome. He seems like he'd be fun to hang out with.
Well, when I got done interviewing him, my wife said, how did it go? And I said, I feel like we're going to be best friends. Like, I love this dude. He was amazing. So
yeah, I'd imagine.
To what you were saying, he really is that genuine and that comfortable in his own skin. Super nice dude. And if COVID is ever gone, I'm definitely going to go up to Austin and hang out with that dude. So that show, Indian Matchmaking on Netflix, I think it got to number 10 in the U.S. and number 1 in India.
Yeah.
What do you think about it captured the nation?
So there are a number of things here that really come into play. I ended up writing this really, really lengthy article about this on Medium titled The South Asian Arms Race for Impressive Biodata. I think it exposed a lot of things that are unsaid but needed to be talked about. There is definitely a lot of problems with the way that we as a culture, particularly Indians, look at marriage and relationships. We put expiration dates on women who are reaching a certain age. And yet, I've seen breathtaking 40-year-old women who are Indian. And it's like, wait a minute, why are we putting a scarlet letter on her just because she's not married? It kind of really highlighted the pressure that we put on women in our culture. I think that we definitely have a double standard for men and women when it comes to the Indian culture. I think it also highlighted the amount of judgment that there is in communities like ours. It's interesting because on the one hand, it's a type of community where people will pick you up from the airport, as we were joking about. They will be there for you when you need them. My parents were telling me that's like, yeah, we see our closest friends 2 times a week. I'm like, I don't even talk to some of my friends who live like an exit away 2 times a week, and they talk every day. And so there is this semblance of community and connection that is really powerful and really, really just something that you look up on with fondness. Now, all that being said, that is the same community that judges each other's kids, compares and contrasts all sorts of stupid things. They basically have colorism. So what I think that this show did more than anything else was that it forced us to have a conversation that we should have had 20 years ago about how we define ambition, how we define success, how we view love and relationships. Because being my age and single is sacrilegious in my community. And yet, in my mind, it's like, okay, yeah, fine, I'll be older when I get married. It's like, do I want to have 60 average years with somebody who I like lukewarm about or kind of wish I didn't marry? Or do I want to have 30 amazing years with somebody? And I've been really fortunate that my parents are very open-minded. They don't really put pressure on us in any one way or another. I mean, like any Indian mom, my mom is like treated often me and my sister not getting married, the source of, the bane of her existence. But, my sister getting married definitely took a lot of the attention off of me for a couple of years. And at the same time, they never anticipated she would marry an Indian guy, and she did. And I think the funny thing is that most of my friends are like, we can't see you with an Indian girl. And I was like, yeah, it's strange as that is. It's one of those things where I think for me, I'd have to have a very open open-minded person who understands the choices I've made. And also, I don't fit the mold in any way at all of what you would expect from, sort of the average Indian male at my age. Like, I just kind of am this anomaly. I think that's actually why I was selected, because I remember I was like, why are you guys interested in me? And they're like, oh, well, we got a lot of doctors, lawyers, and engineers. We need some diversity here. I was like, shocking. You're doing a show about Indians and you have doctors and engineers. So I always say, like, I'm the token misfit / weirdo of the show.
That's funny. Well, that's all that I wanted to talk about the show. It was great for not having been involved in it. I'm sure it was a wildly different experience for you, which is fine. Oh, Vyasar told me one thing that I thought was really, really bizarre. He said he got paid $0.
Yeah, so did I.
What the, how, like, what? Okay, none of my business. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah. I think that we went in knowing that, okay, like this is an opportunity for a lot more. I mean, for some people, it's already led to other things. I'm guessing Nadia is, with her massive now following on Instagram and everything. Again, for me, it was a great opportunity to have a lot of publicity for my work. And, don't get me wrong, I've also had my fair share of like messages from interested women, some of who have been cool, some of who have been crazy. That's just part of it. But I guess I didn't really see it as, okay, we got paid nothing for it. I mean, if you remember the scene with me and the Matchmaker, it was literally I didn't answer any of her questions. I just peppered her with questions the whole time because to me, I was like, this is an opportunity to showcase my interviewing skills, not necessarily give her what she's looking for. Besides, she's a moron anyways, considering who she matched me with. I was like, I told you I'm an avid surfer. You matched me with a person who said she hates the beach.
Yeah, that's a huge misstep and such a easy one to avoid.
Yeah.
Also, if you were a person who drinks, you could play a drinking game about how many times that woman says she's from Mumbai.
Yeah.
It's like it was her last name. Anyway, enough about the show. So I only have a couple more questions. I'll try to make it quick. I know we've been almost an hour. What makes you creative?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think it's perspective. Everybody is creative. And I think the difference between people who think they're creative and those who don't is that people who think and know they're creative are in the habit of expressing their creativity in whatever form that might take. Whether it's, preparing a meal, whether it's making visual art, whether it's making movies, whether it's the way you organize a spreadsheet, all those things are acts of creativity, but we just don't think of them that way because we have this sort of, mindset of associating creativity with art per se, like what we define traditionally as art. But nowadays, the definition of what it means to be creative is so expansive. I mean, that's the reason we have sort of the wide variety of guests that we do. The other thing I think is that I've always been very mindful about having a wide diversity of inputs, from the people that I interview to the books that I read to the experiences that I have. I think there's opportunities everywhere to sort of think creative. Like, one of the things my roommates and I are doing now, or we're going through the entire Marvel universe of movies. And, I wanted to really kind of understand it. So I got the Marvel Encyclopedia, which is this like massive coffee table book. But it's been really cool to see somebody like Stan Lee and his thought process and how he got to where he's at. So I think that everybody has it to some degree. But for me, the big things have been really perspective, insight, and input have really driven my creative process.
Good answer. Now, this one is sort of a bastardization of a question that you ask on just about every show.
Yeah.
The show's called the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. I did ask you what makes you creative.
Yeah.
What makes you unmistakable?
It's funny because I feel like I'm going to tell you the same thing, but I would say more than anything, it's been perspective, because this is the crux of it all, right? When you see somebody who succeeds with something that they do, the natural temptation is to reverse engineer it and follow that process to the letter. And my tendency has always been to deviate from that, even if it's the slightest bit. I mean, like the online course I took about how to start a blog wasn't about how to start a podcast. One of the lessons was interview people. And so instead of interviewing one person, I basically started a weekly series. Like that minor deviation in following instructions basically allowed me to build a career. So I think that there's that aspect of it. But that's the big one, is I think perspective and a diversity of inputs, because this is the way I would sum it up. And I probably alluded to this earlier, is I take other people's ingredients and come up with my own recipes. And that is the heart of what I think makes me in particular unmistakable.
Nice. I would also like to throw in the word tenacity with regard to what makes you unmistakable.
Yeah, I would say I've definitely been persistent and tenacious.
100%.
Sometimes to my own detriment. Like I think that we have to be careful about this narrative of follow your passion, never quit, blah, 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 because that's not always realistic for most people. Like we have to take context into consideration when we put these messages out into the world, and a lot of people don't. And to me, that's really sad. And it's partially, on us to consider the context when we consume information, when we get advice from authorities, but it's also on other people to consider the context when they provide that advice.
I agree 100%. And that goes back to your tuba story. It wasn't you giving up the tuba. It was you realizing that wasn't really a practical future.
Yeah, I mean, not that the future I've chosen now is practical, but yeah, absolutely.
Well, the future you chose didn't exist when you made that decision.
That is true.
Okay, so as we're going out, Srini, is there anything that I didn't ask you or we didn't talk about that you wanted to talk about today?
No, I think you covered a lot of ground. Obviously, like I have the 2 books, which I've told you about, the podcast, but those are the main things. So no, I think you asked great questions. I have actually really enjoyed this conversation. As I told you, I actually don't like being interviewed very often.
Well, I appreciate that. And oddly enough, I interview a lot of people who don't like to be interviewed often. I don't know what it is, but a lot of you people who don't like to be interviewed say yes. So I appreciate it.
Well, which is weird considering that I interview people. So
yes, very. Yeah, I've been interviewed a couple of times and it feels weird to be on the receiving end. Where can people find these books?
So you can find the books on Amazon. As you mentioned, one of them is called An Audience of One, Reclaiming Creativity for Its Own Sake. The other is Unmistakable, Why Only Is Better Than Best. But where you'll find pretty much everything that we do is at unmistakablecreative.com.
Nice. And the podcast, again, is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. It's available everywhere. And I believe there's a website that has a huge archive as well.
Yeah, it's basically unmistakablecreative.com.
Nice. Well, is there a place where people can find you on social medias?
It's funny. I'm not a big social media fan, even though because of Indian Matchmaking, I spent more time on social media than I wanted to. But Twitter, Unmistakable CEO, Instagram, Unmistakable CEO. And actually, you know what? The best place to go if they really want to connect with us is we have a private social network for our listeners. And it's, I believe, let me just double check here. I think it's just unmistakablecreative.com/tribe.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I will definitely be doing that in the near future for sure. And everybody, if you are going to follow Srini on any of those platforms, or if you are going to reach out to him, don't be crazy. Don't ask him dumb shit or try to set him up with your crackhead sister. That's not him.
Let me add a caveat to that.
Unless she's hot.
She can't be a crackhead, but if she's attractive and cool, then by all means set me up with your sister.
There you go. All right. If she's attractive and cool, holler at a fella.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Srinivas Rao, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day and even agreeing to do this ridiculous thing with me. I super duper appreciate it. And it was a pleasure to let everybody get to know you a little bit better on Fascination Street, man. Thank you so mumuch.
Absolutely. I hope you guys enjoy it.
Absolutely. And you have a great rest of your day, man.
You too. Thanks, Steve. This was super fun. Have a good day.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
As always, thanks for listening, Streetwalkers. And don't forget, follow the show on Twitter at FascinationSTPD, on Instagram at Fascination Street Pod. Follow the podcast page on Facebook at Fascination Street Podcast. And of course, you can always email me at fascinationstreetpod@gmail.com. And if you haven't already, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button and rate us on iTunes. Opening music is the song Magnolia from the 2014 album Intransigence, used with permission from Douglas Miles Clark. Closing music is Apollo from the 2001 album Into the Known by the band Sapphire. Thanks for hanging out with us and getting to know a little bit about our guest. We'll see you next time on Fascination Street.